The airport was buzzing with the usual morning noise. Rolling suitcases, soft announcements, and the smell of fresh coffee that somehow made everyone feel a bit more awake. People were rushing toward their gates, holding their boarding passes like small promises that they were going somewhere better, somewhere different. Among the crowd was a woman who didn't look much different from anyone else. She wore a plain gray jacket, carried a small black backpack, and kept her head slightly down as if she was used to moving quietly through the world. She didn't check her phone like the others or chat with anyone in line. She just waited, calm, patient, and strangely still. Her boarding pass read Seat 20D. It was a middle seat, not the most comfortable place to spend a few hours in the air, but she didn't seem to care. The attendant scanned her ticket, smiled politely, and said, "Have a safe flight." She nodded once and stepped onto the plane. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of sanitizer and coffee. Flight attendants were moving swiftly up and down the aisle, helping passengers find their seats and fit their bags into the overhead bins. The woman placed her small backpack under the seat in front of her and quietly sat down. She looked out the window for a moment, though she wasn't next to it. Maybe she just liked to glance at the light streaming through the oval glass. The man in the aisle seat next to her was already talking to someone over the phone. He seemed cheerful, maybe a little too loud for the quiet woman beside him. She smiled politely when he glanced her way, then folded her hands in her lap. As the passengers settled in, the captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and friendly. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. We're expecting smooth weather for most of our flight today, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the trip." The woman in 20D closed her eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, as if she was preparing herself for something more than just a flight. Once the plane took off, the usual rhythm began. The soft clinking of trays, people adjusting their seatbelts, a few kids asking questions their parents tried to answer, but every now and then a small, unnoticeable shift happened in the woman's expression. Her eyes would drift to the wing of the plane, then to the aisle, then back to the window. She seemed alert but calm, the kind of calm that only comes from someone who's been through much harder things. The man beside her tried to start a conversation. "Not a bad day to fly, huh?" he said, smiling. She looked at him for a brief second, nodded slightly, and replied softly, "Yes, it's clear today." Her voice was steady, with a quiet strength that made him pause. It wasn't shyness, it was restraint, as though she'd learned to say only what was necessary. He chuckled awkwardly and went back to scrolling on his phone. She didn't seem offended. If anything, she looked relieved to return to her silence. About an hour into the flight, turbulence began to shake the cabin lightly. It wasn't much, just a small reminder that they were miles above the ground. The flight attendants paused their service for a moment and checked on passengers. Most people just gripped their armrests or muttered something about not liking turbulence. But the woman in 20D didn't even flinch. Her hand stayed still on her lap, her eyes fixed on the seat in front of her. Her breathing didn't change. It was as if her body had learned not to react. A flight attendant walking by noticed it, not the stillness but the sharpness in her gaze. It wasn't fear, it was focus. The attendant thought it was unusual but brushed it off with a smile. People react to flying differently, she told herself. When the turbulence passed, the plane settled again. The captain's voice came through once more, calm and collected. "Sorry about that bit of bumpiness, folks. Nothing to worry about. We'll be cruising smoothly for the rest of the way." A small smile flickered across the woman's lips, quick and barely noticeable, but it was there. She took out a small notebook from her jacket pocket and opened it quietly. The pages were filled with numbers, short notes, and what looked like codes. No one around her could see clearly, but the handwriting was neat and purposeful. She flipped through a few pages, read something, and then closed it gently. She didn't write anything new. A few rows ahead, a child began crying. The mother tried to calm the little one, whispering softly and bouncing the child on her knee. The woman in 20D watched for a moment, and for the first time her expression softened. She smiled faintly, almost as if something about the sound of that cry reminded her of home, or maybe of something she once lost. The man beside her noticed. "You like kids?" he asked kindly, trying again to make small talk. She looked at him, hesitated, then said, "Yes, I do." Her voice had a trace of warmth now. He nodded, encouraged. You traveling for work or family? She paused again. This time her eyes drifted toward the front of the plane, as if she was thinking carefully before answering. Work, she finally said. He smiled. What kind of work? There was another pause. She gave a polite smile, the kind that ended the conversation without making it awkward. It's hard to explain. He laughed softly, raising his hands. Fair enough. The rest of the flight stayed mostly quiet between them. She occasionally looked down at her watch, though it wasn't clear why. It wasn't as if she was in a rush. She just seemed aware of every passing minute. Then, somewhere mid-flight, one of the attendants made an announcement. If there's a medical professional on board, please ring your call button. A man a few rows behind 20D stood up quickly. A doctor. The attendants rushed toward the back of the plane where an elderly passenger had fainted. People craned their necks to look, whispering to each other. The woman in 20D didn't move, but her eyes sharpened again. Her calmness returned, but now there was something else. Readiness. She unbuckled her seatbelt halfway, just in case. It wasn't curiosity. It was instinct. Within minutes, the situation seemed under control. The doctor and attendants managed to stabilize the passenger, and the captain came over the intercom again, reassuring everyone that they'd continue as planned. The woman quietly rebuckled her seatbelt, leaned back, and looked out toward the light breaking through the clouds. Her reflection in the window looked peaceful, but her eyes carried stories that no one else on that plane could imagine. When the attendants passed by again, one of them offered her a drink. Water? She nodded. Yes, please. Long flight for you? The attendant asked politely. Not too long, she said, smiling faintly. I've been on longer ones. The attendant smiled back and moved on, unaware that the woman's words carried more truth than anyone could guess. A few minutes later, the captain made a routine announcement, and for a brief moment the woman's face changed. Her eyes lifted slightly, focusing on the sound of his voice. It was subtle, a flicker of recognition maybe. She tilted her head a bit as if listening carefully. The man beside her noticed it. You okay? He asked. She nodded. Yes, I just recognized something in his tone. He laughed lightly. You know the captain? She didn't answer directly. Maybe, she said, looking back toward the front of the plane. Then she smiled faintly again, almost to herself. It wasn't a joyful smile, more like the kind someone makes when remembering a part of their past they haven't thought about in years. The flight continued quietly. The clouds outside looked like waves frozen in time. The hum of the engines filled the air, steady and strong. The woman in 20D closed her eyes for a while, resting her head against the seat. The man beside her assumed she was asleep, but she wasn't. Her fingers moved slightly, tapping against her armrest in a rhythm, short, coded, deliberate. If anyone had been paying attention, they might have recognized it as a signal, a pattern used by people who once needed to communicate without words. But no one noticed. To everyone else, she was just another passenger in an ordinary seat, and yet somewhere in the cockpit, when the captain checked the passenger manifest later, maybe just out of curiosity, he paused. His eyes froze on one name and his expression changed. He looked at his co-pilot slowly, his voice low. You're not going to believe who's in 20D. The co-pilot frowned. Who? The captain exhaled softly, almost in disbelief. Her call sign's on this list. He looked again, just to be sure. The name matched. Out there, in seat 20D, sat someone who wasn't just a traveler. She was someone the pilots knew from a part of their lives most people never talked about. The skies where calm voices carried the weight of life and death. But for now, no one else knew. She just sat quietly, eyes open, watching the clouds drift past. The woman in seat 20D, whose ordinary presence was about to become anything but. The plane hummed softly through the high blue sky. Passengers had settled into their routines, some watching movies, some sleeping, and some chatting quietly. But the woman in seat 20D stayed still, her eyes occasionally wandering toward the aisle as if her mind wasn't on the flight itself, but somewhere else entirely. Up in the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot exchanged a look. The name on the passenger list still lingered in the captain's thoughts. He couldn't stop thinking about it. You sure it's the same person? The co-pilot asked quietly, adjusting a dial. The captain nodded slowly. I'm sure. That call sign. You don't forget something like that. They both fell silent for a moment, each remembering a time when call signs weren't just names. They were lifelines. Voices that came through crackling radios in the middle of chaos. Voices that meant someone out there was watching their back. Down in the cabin, the woman opened her notebook again. She flipped to the middle where there was a small folded photograph tucked between the pages. She looked at it briefly and a tiny smile touched her lips, the kind that's filled with both warmth and pain. Then she closed the notebook and slipped it back into her jacket pocket. The man beside her noticed. "Old photo?" he asked, curious but polite. She glanced at him, considering whether to answer. "Yes," she said quietly. "A long time ago. Family?" She shook her head slowly. "Crew," he raised an eyebrow. "Crew?" "Work crew," she added, her tone light but distant, like she didn't want to say more. He nodded, sensing that she wasn't just another business traveler. There was something about her posture, straight, steady, and watchful, that didn't fit the usual passenger look. After a while, the flight attendants began serving lunch. The smell of warm bread and coffee filled the air. When they reached row 20, the attendant smiled. "Chicken or pasta?" "Pasta, please," the woman said softly. She thanked the attendant and began eating quietly, taking slow, thoughtful bites. She wasn't in a hurry. Everything she did seemed deliberate, controlled, like someone who'd learned the value of staying calm in every situation. As she finished, a sudden sound came over the intercom. A light chime, then the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've received a weather update. There's a developing storm along our route, so we'll be adjusting our altitude and course slightly. Nothing to worry about, just standard procedure." Passengers murmured quietly. A few looked uneasy. The woman in 20D simply looked up and stared ahead, her expression unreadable. The plane began to shift gently as it turned. Outside, the clouds thickened, and the sunlight dimmed slightly. The calm blue slowly turned gray. A young flight attendant stopped near 20D to check seatbelts. She smiled nervously. "Everything okay, ma'am?" "Yes," the woman said softly, giving a reassuring nod. Her tone was calm enough to ease the attendant's worry. But inside, she was listening not to the cabin noise, but to the faint hum of the engines, the subtle vibration of the fuselage, the rhythm of the plane itself. She seemed to understand it in a way that others didn't. The turbulence came slowly. First a gentle shake, then a harder one. A few people gasped. The man beside her gripped the armrest. "You okay with flying?" he asked nervously. She turned to him, her voice steady. "Yes, I used to fly." He blinked, surprised. "You were a pilot?" Her eyes softened slightly, as if remembering something far away. "Something like that," she said. Just then, the plane jolted again. A baby cried a few rows behind. The lights flickered for a second before steadying again. The attendants moved quickly but professionally, checking on passengers, keeping everyone calm. The woman's expression didn't change, but her hand, resting on her knee, made a small motion, almost like she was counting beats in her mind. In the cockpit, things were getting tense. The radar screen showed a large storm system ahead, stretching wider than expected. The captain adjusted the controls, trying to steer around the worst of it. "Let's climb another 2,000 feet, he said to the co-pilot. As they began the climb, the co-pilot glanced at the manifest again. "You think she knows what's going on?" The captain gave a small nod. "If it's her, she knows. She probably felt that change before we even made it." Back in row 20, the woman's eyes flicked upward slightly. She felt the plane's climb in her bones. Years of flying had tuned her senses. She could tell the altitude shift by how her ears adjusted and how the sound of the engines changed. Her calmness caught the attention of another passenger across the aisle, an older lady who looked a little frightened. The woman in 20D turned toward her gently and said, "It's okay, just a bit of wind. They're doing everything right." Her voice carried quiet confidence, the kind that made people believe her. The older lady smiled nervously and nodded. Minutes passed, and slowly the turbulence eased. The plane steadied. The tension in the cabin faded back into normal chatter and soft music from the overhead speakers. The man beside her sighed in relief. "You sure seem used to this," he said. She smiled faintly. "You could say that," he chuckled. "What kind of work did you say you did?" She hesitated again. "I was in operations." Aviation side, his eyes widened. So like air traffic control? Sometimes, she said, her tone vague. Sometimes more than that. There was a short silence. Then he asked softly, "Military?" Her gaze shifted toward the window. For a few seconds she said nothing. Then she nodded once. "Yes." He blinked, impressed. "Wow, I didn't expect that." "What did you do?" "Communications," she said simply. He nodded slowly, realizing she wasn't the type to brag. But her calm, disciplined air suddenly made sense. Everything about her, the posture, the alertness, even the quiet way she spoke, fit perfectly. Up front, the captain adjusted the radio. "Control, this is Flight 784, requesting updated storm path confirmation." Static crackled, then a reply came through. The captain's eyes flickered briefly. The co-pilot frowned. "You look pale." The captain took a breath. That voice. The controller just now, she used to be our flight leader. Years ago? The co-pilot blinked. "You mean her? The one with the call sign?" The captain nodded. "Yeah, Echo 7, that's her." He leaned back slightly, almost in disbelief. After all these years. The co-pilot shook his head. "What are the odds?" The captain gave a small smile. "Seems she's still keeping an eye on us, even from seat 20D. The storm passed gradually. The sun broke through the clouds again, lighting the cabin with soft golden light. People relaxed, laughing, chatting again as if nothing had happened. The woman in 20D finally leaned back, closing her eyes. For a brief moment she looked peaceful, almost like someone who'd finally found a bit of quiet after a long time of noise. The man beside her took a sip of water and said quietly, "You know, you don't seem like someone who just sits still. You look like you belong up there, in the cockpit." Her lips curved slightly. "Maybe once," she said. "But not anymore. Why not?" he asked gently. She looked down for a moment, then said, "Because sometimes, after enough flights, you learn it's okay to let someone else take the controls." There was something in her tone, a softness, a hint of pain and wisdom mixed together. The man didn't ask more. He just nodded respectfully. Later, as the attendants dimmed the lights for the evening part of the flight, most passengers drifted into sleep. The hum of the engines filled the quiet. The woman remained awake, staring out at the fading orange sky beyond the wing. Her mind wandered back to long nights in air control towers, to headsets crackling with voices under pressure, to moments when every second mattered. She remembered the sound of pilots depending on her voice. Steady, calm, always sure. Her call sign, Echo 7, wasn't just a name. It was a promise, a voice that never broke even when everything else did. Now, sitting in seat 20D, miles above the earth, she realized how strange it felt to be the one on the receiving end, trusting someone else's voice in the cockpit. The flight continued peacefully. But somewhere deep inside she knew something was different about this journey. Not just the storm they had crossed, something else was coming. And up in the cockpit, the captain couldn't help but glance once more at the passenger list, his mind full of old memories, missions, voices, and one steady signal that had once guided him safely through chaos. Echo 7, he whispered under his breath, still flying with us. Outside, the sky darkened into night. The plane cut smoothly through the clouds, carrying its quiet mystery forward. A woman in seat 20D, a pilot who once heard her voice through static and fear, and a story that was far from over. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains of Pam's room, gently waking her. The ocean waves outside sounded softer than before, like the world was taking a deep breath after a long night. She stretched slowly, feeling more rested than she had in days. For a few moments, everything felt peaceful. She made herself a cup of tea, opened the balcony door, and let the fresh air fill the room. It was going to be a simple, quiet day, or so she thought. After getting ready, she decided to explore the hotel a bit more. She put on her light jacket, grabbed her bag, and headed down to the lobby. The same receptionist from yesterday was at the desk, chatting and laughing with another guest. When he saw her walking toward the elevator, his smile faded again, but Pam didn't let it bother her. She just gave a polite nod and continued walking. The hotel was even bigger than she had realized. There was a long hallway lined with paintings, a spa on the lower floor, and a cafe that looked out over the garden. She thought about getting a coffee there, but before she could, she overheard a group of hotel staff whispering near the entrance. One of them said quietly, That woman from 514, she's still here. I thought she'd be gone by now. Another laughed and said, maybe she's hoping someone will mistake her for a VIP. Pam paused for a second, pretending to check her phone so they wouldn't know she was listening. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't anger she felt. It was disappointment. She wondered how many guests had been treated the same way before her. People who just wanted a peaceful stay but were made to feel small. She walked past them without saying a word and stepped out into the garden. The sound of birds and the smell of blooming flowers quickly helped her feel calm again. She sat on a wooden bench near the fountain and closed her eyes. Sometimes silence spoke louder than anything else. Later that afternoon, she returned to the restaurant for lunch. This time it was less crowded, but the same waiter from the night before was there. His face showed the same disinterest. He barely greeted her and dropped the menu on the table with a half-hearted smile. Pam looked at him and said kindly, "I'll just have soup and some bread, please." He nodded and walked off without another word. As she waited, a young couple entered the restaurant. They were dressed elegantly. The woman wore a silk dress and the man had a watch that looked expensive. The waiter immediately changed his tone, greeting them warmly and guiding them to a prime seat near the window. Pam noticed the difference right away. The couple got full attention while she sat quietly near the back again. When her soup arrived, it was lukewarm. She didn't complain. She stirred it gently and thought about how strange people could be. So much energy was spent trying to impress those who already had everything, while those who just wanted kindness were left unseen. As she finished her meal, the restaurant manager came by, checking on guests. When he stopped by her table, he barely glanced at her. "Everything fine?" he asked quickly, already turning away before she could answer. "Yes, thank you," she said softly, though he was already gone. Pam paid her bill and went to the hotel lobby. She wanted to sit for a while, maybe read something, but as she passed by the reception desk, she noticed a small crowd forming near the entrance. The hotel staff suddenly seemed more alert, fixing their uniforms, straightening their ties. A tall man in a suit whispered something to the receptionists. Pam didn't pay much attention at first, assuming it was just another important guest arriving. But she noticed something. The staff who had ignored her earlier were now standing straighter, their smiles wider. The energy in the room had changed completely. Pam sat quietly on one of the couches and opened her book. A few minutes later, the receptionist, who had been rude to her the day before, walked by with a tray of champagne glasses, his attitude completely different. It almost made her laugh. She had seen this kind of behavior before, fake politeness, all depending on who was watching. As she sat there, a housekeeping lady passed by, an older woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She recognized Pam and stopped for a second. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I hope your stay is comfortable." Pam looked up and smiled warmly. "Yes, it's lovely. Thank you." The woman nodded and said, "If you need anything, please let me know. I'm on your floor." It was the first genuine kindness Pam had felt since she arrived. She appreciated it more than she could express. Later that evening, as she was heading back to her room, she overheard two guests complaining about the staff. One of them said, "They act nice only if you look rich enough." "It's ridiculous," Pam smiled to herself. At least she wasn't the only one who noticed. She spent the evening writing again in her notebook. Each page had small details. The words the staff used, the way they spoke to certain guests, how quickly they changed when someone important arrived. Her notes were detailed, but her tone was calm. She wasn't writing out of anger. She was observing. When she finished, she closed the notebook and looked around her room. It was quiet, the air cool from the open balcony door. She could hear faint music from the restaurant downstairs, people laughing, glasses clinking. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened. Pam leaned back on her chair and thought about how unfair it all was, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been treated as less than. She thought of the people who worked hard their whole lives and still got ignored because they didn't wear the right clothes or have the right accent. It made her think of her own past, of times when she had been underestimated, but those moments had taught her something valuable. You don't need to prove your worth to anyone. The truth always comes out, often in ways people don't expect. The next morning, things felt different. The hotel was buzzing with activity. Staff members rushed around, checking rooms, adjusting flowers, polishing tables. Pam watched them from the lobby, curious about the sudden change. The receptionist who had ignored her before now wore a nervous smile. Even the manager seemed unusually alert, glancing around as if waiting for someone. Pam asked one of the bellboys what was going on. He replied quietly, "The regional hotel owner might visit today. Everyone's panicking to make sure everything looks perfect." Pam nodded, hiding a small smile. "I see." She sat down and sipped her coffee, pretending to be just another guest watching the commotion. The staff who had once looked down on her were now running around, fixing every detail. It was almost ironic. A few minutes later, she heard the manager telling the team, "If anyone important shows up, treat them with full attention. No mistakes today." Pam turned her gaze toward the ocean through the glass walls. The light shimmered across the water, calm and steady, just like her. She knew something they didn't. The visit they were all preparing for wasn't a rumor. It was real. And she was the reason for it, but she said nothing. Not yet. Instead, she decided to take a quiet walk outside while they fussed over appearances. She smiled at the irony. The same people who couldn't even greet her properly 2 days ago were now desperate to impress someone with power. As she walked along the beach, she thought about how people reveal who they truly are when they think no one important is watching. That's when character shows, not during grand events but in simple moments. Like when a tired traveler checks in after a long flight. When she returned, the staff were still running around, fixing every little thing. The energy was tense. The receptionist even tried to greet her this time, forcing a polite smile. Pam smiled back, her calm eyes steady. "Good afternoon, Miss Bondi," he said, reading her name from the system. "Good afternoon," she replied kindly. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but stopped. Maybe he felt guilty, maybe just nervous. Either way, she could sense a shift. The next day would bring even more change, but not the kind they were expecting. As night fell, Pam packed her notes neatly into her bag. She looked out at the glowing lights of the hotel and the ocean beyond. She knew tomorrow would be the day when truth quietly stepped into the room. The day the staff would realize who she truly was. But tonight, she rested with peace in her heart, knowing she didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her patience was her strength. And soon the same people who had looked down on her would understand that real power doesn't wear expensive clothes. It carries itself with grace, even when no one is watching. The morning light poured softly through the airplane windows, turning the cabin golden. Passengers began to stir awake, stretching their arms and rubbing sleepy eyes. A few looked out at the sunrise and smiled, relieved the night was over. The woman in seat 20D opened her eyes slowly. She blinked against the soft light, her body still calm and steady, as if she'd only closed her eyes for a few moments. Not for sleep, but for rest. She looked around quietly. The man beside her was still half asleep, his head leaned to one side. Across the aisle, a mother whispered to her child, pointing at the clouds outside. Everything looked peaceful now, but the peace felt different this time. There was a quiet understanding in her heart, that moment from the night before, the voice she'd sent through the emergency link, the small act that kept the flight steady. It was over now. No one knew except the pilots, and that was enough. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and warm. "Good morning, everyone. We've passed through the rough patch and have clear skies all the way to our destination. We'll begin our descent in about an hour. Thank you for your patience and for flying with us today." The woman in 20D smiled faintly. She looked out at the bright clouds below, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For the first time in years, she was flying not as a voice in someone's ear, but as a passenger, quiet, unseen, and content. The man beside her woke up fully now. "Morning," he said, stretching. "Did I sleep through the whole thing?" She nodded, amused. "Pretty much." He rubbed his eyes. "That turbulence last night, and you were right. They handled it perfectly." She smiled softly. "Yes, they did." He laughed lightly. "You really trust pilots?" Her eyes softened. "I've spent half my life listening to them. You learn to trust people who hold their calm in the sky." He tilted his head, curious. "You were one of those voices, weren't you?" She didn't seem surprised that he'd figured it out. She just nodded. "Yes, I guided flights, mostly in active zones. Sometimes with weather so bad even radar couldn't see through it." He whistled quietly. "That sounds intense. Ever get scared?" She smiled faintly. Every time. But fear isn't the problem. Silence is. When the radio goes quiet, that's when it's real. He looked at her thoughtfully, and you were that voice, the one that broke the silence. She paused, then said softly, "Someone had to be." They sat in silence for a few seconds. The engines hummed steadily beneath them, smooth and confident. After a while, the attendants came by with breakfast trays. The smell of coffee filled the cabin again, along with warm bread and fruit. The woman took her cup of coffee, held it in her hands for a moment, and smiled faintly. "It's strange," she said. "I've spent so many nights drinking coffee in towers waiting for daylight. Now I'm seeing it from up here instead of below." The man smiled. "Feels different?" She nodded. "Lighter." They talked quietly while eating, small simple things about where they were going and what they did. The man said he was visiting his sister after years of not seeing her. The woman listened with gentle interest, asking small questions that made him open up more easily. She had that kind of presence, quiet but grounding. When he asked about her destination, she hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm heading to a memorial." He grew quiet. "For—" She looked down at her cup. "For those who never made it back." He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Her tone carried the story. For the next half hour, the plane continued in smooth silence. The sunlight outside was bright now, almost blinding over the wings. Then a small knock came on her armrest. She looked up. It was one of the flight attendants, smiling politely. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said softly. "The captain asked if he could have a quick word with you in the galley when you're free." The woman blinked in surprise. "With me?" "Yes, ma'am," the attendant said kindly. "Just a quick chat. No rush." The man beside her raised his eyebrows. "You're in trouble?" He teased lightly. She smiled faintly. "I doubt it." She unbuckled her seatbelt and followed the attendant toward the back galley. Passengers glanced briefly as she passed, but no one thought much of it. The captain was waiting there, standing near the service counter with his cap tucked under his arm. His expression was calm but warm, like someone meeting an old friend after a long time. "Morning, ma'am," he said softly. "Thank you for taking a moment." She gave a small nod. "Of course," he hesitated, then smiled gently. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything. But after last night, I couldn't just let you leave without saying it." Her eyes lifted slightly. "You recognized me," he nodded. "I did. Took me a minute to believe it, though. I never thought I'd see Echo 7 on a passenger list." She smiled quietly. "It's been a long time since anyone called me that." He exhaled softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "You probably don't remember, but years ago, during the coastal mission, your voice came through when we were losing power. You kept us steady until we made it back. I never forgot that." She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression softened. "You made it home. That's what mattered." He nodded, emotion flickering in his eyes. "We did because of you. And last night, when we lost signal for a few minutes, you came through again, didn't you?" She didn't answer right away. Her smile was small, humble. "Old habits," she said softly. He chuckled. "Well, those habits saved a lot of lives. And probably a few last night, too." For a few seconds, they just stood there, quiet but connected. Two people bound by skies they'd once shared without ever meeting. The captain finally said, "It's good to see you're still flying, even if it's just as a passenger now." She looked out the small galley window where clouds drifted by like soft waves. "I never stopped flying," she said. "Just changed my view." He smiled, understanding perfectly. "If you ever decide to come back, we'd be honored to have you in the tower again." She shook her head gently. "No, it's time for the new voices now. Mine's done its part." He extended his hand respectfully. "Then let me just say thank you, from every pilot you ever guided." She took his hand, firm but kind. "You're welcome. Fly safe." With that, she turned and made her way back to her seat. As she walked down the aisle, she noticed passengers chatting and laughing again, unaware of what had just passed between her and the cockpit, and that was exactly how she liked it. When she sat down again, the man beside her looked curious. "Everything okay?" She smiled softly. "Yes, just an old friend saying hello." He chuckled. "You have friends in high places, huh?" She laughed quietly. "Something like that." The announcement tone rang again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please make sure your seat backs and trays are upright as we prepare for landing." The woman fastened her belt, her gaze drifting once more to the sky outside. She could already see the land below, rivers, fields, and distant cities waking up. As the plane lowered, the pressure changed slightly, and her ears popped softly. She smiled. It was such a small thing, but it reminded her she was still part of the world, grounded, alive. The man beside her leaned closer. "You nervous about landing?" She shook her head gently. "No, landings are my favorite part. They mean you made it." The wheels touched down smoothly, the engines roaring for a moment before settling. A soft cheer rippled through the cabin, as it always did when planes landed safely. The woman smiled faintly, watching people clap, laugh, and reach for their phones. She stayed seated for a moment longer, letting everyone rush ahead. When it was her turn, she stood up slowly, grabbed her small backpack, and looked once more down the aisle. The captain was standing near the cockpit door, greeting passengers as they left. When she reached him, he gave a small nod of respect, a silent salute that only they understood. She returned it with a quiet smile. "Clear skies," she said softly. "Always," he replied. As she stepped off the plane and into the light of the terminal, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. She wasn't Echo 7 anymore. She was just another traveler, walking among others with her head high and her heart light. But somewhere deep in the cockpit of that plane, two pilots knew the truth, that the calm voice that once guided them through chaos had just flown with them one more time. And as the plane prepared for its next flight, the captain couldn't help but smile, whispering to himself, "She's still watching the skies.